Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Now, there are some people, of course, who say that they have to get out of the church because it is irretrievably sexist. There is no way around it, and that therefore we have to form alternate communities. And I think that that is at least one phase of the women church movement.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Karen Cataphias, who is a local staff writer. Father Bacik and Ms. Cataphias will discuss Rosemary Radford Ruther and the Woman Church movement. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Karen, I find it interesting that you, a representative of the print media, are here on the radio with me. You do such a fine job as a journalist, and I appreciate you coming on the program with me. And because I want to talk a little bit about the feminist movement from a Christian perspective. I'd like to talk about the church and the feminist movement, and I'd like to use Rosemary Radford Ruther, leading feminist theologian, as our guide in doing this. That's a person that both you and I respect and find enlightenment in her thinking, and so I'd like to go with that a bit. I was thinking about Rosemary is quite remarkable. There's she's 51 years old now. She got married when she was 20, and in a 6-year period, Rosemary completed a BA, an MA, a very fine PhD at Claremont Graduate School, and during those 6 years bore 3 children. I find that to be a remarkable kind of experience that she brings. She's a woman of immense energy, and I mean, it really is hard for me to believe that she could do that. And I notice her reactions to that are fascinating. Part of her reaction is she feels good and satisfied, I suppose a justifiable pride in doing it, but it points her to the experience of women, the injustice in women having to have a career or trying to have a career, and then also being expected to do more than their share of the domestic duties and the child-rearing things. Well, that's a long introduction. You want to pick up on any of that?
I just would add that I don't know if she'd be happy to be held up as a model of superwoman, because so many women are fighting against that. We always can't do it all. It's difficult.
Yes, and I mean, it is her response to say what it makes her feel mostly is the injustice of women trying to do 2 things. I think that's one of her great criticisms of where we're at in society today. She's always talking, well, why, are women in this subjugated position? And then we got women who say, well, I want to make my own life, and I want to have my own career. And then they get married, and they find out that they have to run home from work and take care of children and cook meals, while the males are able to do their networking, of having a beer with the decision makers or improving their status in the corporation and so on. And she thinks that women are really put into a bad position that way.
Sure. Statistics show that in households where both the husband and wife work, the woman does about 90% of the household duties. She continues to, even though she's working 40 hours outside the home as he is.
90%.
I think it's something outrageous like that. It's very lopsided.
I know in dealing with the young people, I often find that when they're getting married, they will speak about partnership, and they will verbalize a sort of 50-50 approach to doing the domestic chores and child rearing. But when I talk to them a few years later, especially the women, they will say it doesn't get anywhere near 50%. If they're doing 75-25, they feel like they've got a pretty good deal compared to their other female friends.
Yes, there's still a long way to go.
Indeed. And I think Rosemary Ruther recognizes that. I think in relationship to this church question, we should locate Rosemary a little bit. As I said, she was born, 51 years old, born in 1936. That was a good year. And Rosemary grew up in a Catholic family. Her mother was a Catholic and has maintained a connection with the Catholic Church throughout her life. I think there's been times when she's been more distant from it. She talks about her relationship as an intense but non-exclusive interest in the Catholic community. And her words are carefully chosen. She does remain a Catholic. She continues to worship regularly at the university parish at Northwestern University, and she goes there with her husband, who's a very dedicated Catholic. She has 3 children. She describes them as having a rather loose relationship with the Church, and I suppose she would be typical in that of many Catholics her age who are saying their children don't have the same sort of commitment to the Catholic community as they have had or maintained. And I think that at the same time, Rosemary has been extremely critical of the Catholic Church, and especially for its patriarchal system, its clericalism, which we might talk a little bit about, and for the sexist attitudes that she sees there.
Yes, and not only the Catholic Church. She's she's not exclusive in her criticism. She is aware of, even in churches where women are ordained, she's very keenly aware of the kind of discrimination they still face.
She is indeed, and she did belong to a more of an ecumenical community when she lived in Washington. She taught at Howard University, a predominantly black school in the Washington area, for 10 years, and I think during a lot of that time was involved in a more ecumenical community, and so she has a broad-based interest and a great knowledge of a lot of different traditions. Although I think we could say she is concentrated on the Judeo-Christian tradition, and as she says in her very important book, Sexism and God Talk, that she has not really delved into the Eastern religions and those traditions as much as she might like. So she's focused on the Judeo-Christian tradition, and therefore the Christian churches have been a large part of her research and her uncovering of the sexist attitudes. When we begin to look at this again, she really does a lot of consciousness raising for us. So let's look at some of her negative critiques of the Church. I mean, one thing clearly in the Catholic community is that women can't be ordained and can't move up into the power positions that are there. As you well pointed out, in Protestant churches where women are ordained, Rosemary feels that they are simply co-opted into a clerical culture, that they simply exist in a patriarchal kind of situation and can't function in the free and spontaneous way that they might like.
Yes, I think she compares that to so-called liberal feminism in the broader society, that idea that you just add women to the structures that exist, or as somebody once called it, add women and stir. That feminism is not what she's about. She wants to change the structures because otherwise women are caught up in and end up perpetuating the very structures that have kept them subordinate for so long.
You think Rosemary would want to be ordained herself? I think I remember her saying she didn't, but
I remember that same answer.
Although she talks about times when she was at Protestant Eucharists and was invited to celebrate, and she says how easy that was to do. She said she had no instruction or anything, and she found it an easy thing to do, a very simple thing, and found it interesting that the persons who asked her just assumed she would be able to do it. So she has, a lot of times she talks about that idea of being the main celebrant at the liturgy as being not requiring that much skill and not really requiring much training. I suppose that in my own mind, if one thought of that celebrant at the Eucharist as being the preacher as well, that might broaden out her consideration there. In other words, it isn't just that to figure out what words to say over the bread and wine. I mean, it is to gain a whole sense of what the liturgy is about and a feeling for relationships with the congregation, and especially the kind of knowledge that would be needed to preach well. So I don't know how seriously she meant that kind of comment, but I see that in her writings periodically, and I would just think that the idea of celebrating the Eucharist is a much broader notion than that.
Yes, I think I heard her talk about that as well, and I think what I got from that is she was trying to say that we don't necessarily have to have an ordained person to lead a celebration, a liturgy, because somebody who's sitting in the pews may have a liturgical talent, an ability to get up and lead a congregation and to preach. And so it's really a personal kind of gift rather than to say that a certain class of people have that ability by some mysterious power given to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's certainly one of her important points along that line. But we don't want to limit this to the ordination question, because as you well pointed out, it's a broader question than that of sexism in the church as a whole. And maybe, do you want to say more about that, the way that comes out, and how women feel about that, how women experience what we might call this patriarchy in the church?
One of the things that has stayed with me is a quote that she has in her book, Women Church, Theology and Practice of Feminist Liturgical Communities. And that's, the quote is something like, women in contemporary churches are suffering from linguistic deprivation and Eucharistic famine. And I think she says it quite well for those women who are sensing that sort of lack in their own churches. It seems to me there are women who may, in theory, be supportive of feminist causes within the church. They may want to see women ordained. They decry the sexism that exists in churches, but their soul isn't quite into it until they feel this lack in liturgy, this Eucharistic famine, this linguistic deprivation.
And when they begin to feel that, then we often get women getting into great sense of rage and anger. In other words, it seems to sharpen that, well, why am I deprived like this? And I don't want to be deprived like this. And I need nourishment for my soul. And what about this institution? Why is this happening? And I think that we end up with the phenomenon of great anger and rage. And I think one of Rosemary's points about that is that that's a necessary phase, that when women sort of get in touch with this situation, the sexism in the church, that anger is a very natural and appropriate sort of response. And therefore, Rosemary sort of sets the stage for understanding women who feel the need to leave the church. But I think it's important to point out, Rosemary, always the balanced sort of thinker and moderate thinker, that she says that rage is not a final place to be.
No.
That there's a new stage to get to, that where one has moved beyond the anger, or knows how to mobilize the anger to make some sort of constructive changes.
But I also like the fact that she says, don't just gloss over that anger. Don't repress it. Don't stifle it again like you have for so long, because it will come out in other ways. You won't be able to move to that new stage until you've fully dealt with the anger that you feel, and it is a very understandable kind of anger.
Now, there are some people, of course, who say that they have to get out of the church because it is irretrievably sexist. There's no way around it, and that therefore we have to form alternate communities. And I think that that is at least one phase of the women church movement, where they want to disassociate themselves from the mainline churches, develop their own liturgies, develop their own understanding of God, nurture one another, and so on. So do you want to say anything more about what I would call the most radical side of the women church movement?
I think there are those groups that have done that, but from my perspective, I think women church groups are still tied in many ways with the institutional church. Many women use women church groups as kind of a support system to enable them to go back into the institution and keep fighting. And it's a very important source of support. And it's true that within those women church groups, they work out their own very experiential kind of theology, dealing with different images of God, broadening those, changing the language of liturgy so women aren't addressed as brothers exclusively or referred to as sons of God. A very simple thing like that. That's that linguistic deprivation that she talks about. But which also includes God images, expanding those into male-female images and beyond, into genderless kind of images. So women church, yeah, I think there is that fringe group, but from my experience, the people that are still involved in the women church movement and use that term are those that retain ties to the institution because they don't want to see the institution continue as it is. They're very keenly aware of the sense of, I'm not going to leave the church because it's my church too, and if I leave it, I won't have any kind of input in changing it.
Were you at that women's church conference recently?
Yes, in Cincinnati. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What was the mood there?
It was very interesting. I had gone to the similar conference 4 years ago in Chicago, which was the first, and I could detect a real change in attitude. In Chicago, the talk was still a lot about ordination, and there was kind of a defensive posture of let's get out all the arguments that so we could answer the attacks on us and we could defend our position. In Cincinnati, 4 years later, there was a sense of rightness about the position of women should have an equal place in the church. The lack of defensiveness was gone because people were convinced of the moral and just position that they held, and there was a mutual kind of support there, a sense of let's explore theology, images of God, and let's also broaden what we're doing and not simply talk about ordination anymore, and not simply talk about the church, but talk about all unjust structures that exist, all systems of oppression. And so it was very inclusive. There were conferences on Native Americans, on poverty and economics, on blacks and Hispanics, abuse, any kind of situation where there was an oppression of people. And in a real sense, it was very humane. I found it a very integrating kind of experience.
That's well summarized. It strikes me that many of Rosemary Ruther's ideas have gotten into that movement and seems to reflect a lot of her own outlook. One thing that strikes me is that her constant effort to work on all types of oppression. In other words, she will say that the patriarchal society ends up causing all kind of difficulties. There is racial oppression, ethnic repression, religious minorities are often oppressed, and even the humans stand over against the non-human world. Mm-hmm. And don't deal well with the animal kingdom and with the world of nature, dominating and polluting and so on. So she's keenly aware of all of the ways in which a patriarchal society ends up, I think, hurting and marginalizing and oppressing people. That's always been an important part of her work. Of course, she's focused lately on mostly the problem of sexism and is really, I think, specialized in that. And that's why I would call her one of our leading feminist theologians.
Yes. I attended several press conferences at the conference, and Ruther was at one of them, and it seemed to me that even there she was becoming more aware or maybe more interested in this whole sense of the broadening of the women's movement. Now, I think she has already spoken on that question and has seen it happening. To me, this really illustrates the interplay between women, feminist theologians like Ruther, and the women's movement in the church. It's kind of a give and take. There's a growth, and you can see the parallel in the ideas coming out of theologians and the actual experiences of women. It's a very interesting kind of harmony that's happening. One example of just that sense of let's explore all kinds of domination, including human over nature. At one of the sessions was a woman who was trained in Native American thought, and her whole thrust was the sense of let's be at one with nature. It threw me back to the 60s and the whole ecology movement, but it was interesting to see this in the broader context of all kinds of oppression have to end.
Do you think that Rosemary Ruther is respected in that women's organization? I mean, do they call upon her? I don't know this. I mean, I've never heard her referred to in that secular way.
I'm not certain of that. I know the movement, even in Cincinnati, was very ecumenical in the sense there were other churches involved, and even non-Christian women were there. Gloria Steinem spoke at the conference.
Yes, I recall that.
And she had a very interesting point. She asked the women there, if they would bring their liturgical and ritual experience and skills to secular women's meetings, because she saw the lack existing there.
That's the kind of thing I was looking for. That's interesting. Yeah.
It wasn't directed to Ruth or specifically,
right.
but
they do see that need for the theological religious side.
Yes.
At least some do.
Yeah.
No, that's good. I think that's a healthy development.
I do too.
The other thing that I was picking up from what you said, Karen, was Rosemary Ruther's own approach to this thing is, I think, that what is needed are nurturing communities so that people can find their strength and their guidance and some sense of mutuality and companionship so that they can go about the work of liberation, so they can continue to fight sexism within the church. And I think she likes that idea of saying maybe you would go to a women's church gathering in order to find that nourishment, but then you would stay involved in the Catholic Church and try to bring some of those ideas into there and to see what sort of reform you could move towards. I think she's got that sociological sense that you must remain related to the institution if you're going to be able to change it. That's always the way the reformers have had to try to deal with things. I mean, do you stay within and make a difference, or do you go outside of it and distance yourself from it? I see Rosemary standing definitely in the line of those who think that, at least at this point in history, that it's better to stay in and that you can have greater leverage that way.
Yes, one word or phrase that I like very much from her is that she calls women church groups to begin to live the new humanity now. Because women, many women and men too, are frustrated with the slowness of institutional change, and they have these insights and these needs, and they don't know what to do with them. And so the women church groups provide a place, a supportive, warm, nurturing, and open, inclusive place to begin to live out these new systems of relation and these new ideas of God and church.
Well, that brings up, I think, a general point in Rosemary's thought, and I'm not sure that I have a good handle on this, but she often does talk about the new humanity, and I think what she'll say is that we don't know what that looks like exactly, that's sort of the goal towards which we're moving. We know it will be a transcending and a transforming of patterns of domination, and that it will be more relational and mutual and so on. But that's sort of the ideal towards which we move. I think I would relate it to the kingdom notion, that in the Gospels the kingdom is the ideal. It's always hard to know exactly what the kingdom looks like, but because we never experience it directly. And therefore we have to keep moving along that path. So her new humanity idea I think functions as that sort of ideal. I think that at its best what it will do is be a catalyst for human effort. And I like the point you made too, that what you've got to do is pattern it or make it real in the local situation, to do it as much as is possible. I suppose you could think of that happening in parishes where males and females try to work side by side to improve the parish life, and where in meetings and so on there would be give and take, and people's ideas would be respected, or in prayer groups where male and female experience of God, their deeper religious experiences, would be brought forward and raised up and there for everybody to sort of look at and to learn about and to find their own experience enriched. So yes. I think that's the kind of thing that she's after.
Well, when we talk about the kingdom, I think the irony here that Ruther would point out is that if the church is about bringing about the kingdom, then why is the church not ending the oppressive structure within itself that has differences between men and women, where there's one subordinate and one dominant and so on? The church should be part of the redeeming community and bringing about these very changes that it seems to be bucking against.
I think that Rosemary would want to take us back to the scriptures again and to see ways in which that might enrich our understanding of the church. I know one of the things that she will point out is that you've got in the Gospels, Luke being a good example, these stories of divine favor and forgiveness which are sort of lavished on the people who are despised. So Jesus can eat with the sinners, for example, or he relates well to even to the tax collectors, and very often, again, in Luke's gospel, is so interesting along this feminist line, because she often parallels the males with the females. So there will be Simeon and Anna, both saying something at the time in the infancy narratives, or that we're looking for the way God deals with people, and there will be stories of women as well as men in the parables. So I think what Rosemary would say is that we could look to the Scriptures for help to improve our church life. In other words, there is a thrust towards equality, if I could use that phrase, that we could latch on to, and especially by looking at Jesus then and seeing the way Jesus himself seemed to create an inclusive community by his own actions.
Yes, or looking at the Beatitudes, or the words of the Magnificat, or the words from Isaiah that Jesus quoted at the beginning of his ministry, that sense of the mighty shall be brought down from their thrones, and the lowly brought up.
So what she would say is that we've got to look through the Scriptures and look beyond the dominant sexist tradition and see the other sides of it. We don't have much time. One thing comes to mind. She says, as long in the Pauline letters where it says women be silent in church, must indicate that women were speaking in church.
Yes.
And so that tells us there was a sort of a countercultural move at the time that lost out, but women must have been speaking in church and must have been in some sort of leadership position. Well, Karen, we've been trying to talk about Rosemary Ruther, a leading feminist theologian, one who really startles us often by her radical criticisms. And I know many people find it hard to deal with that. I have friends who say they can't read Rosemary Ruther, or they can't go to her lectures because she seems so radical and so on, and so difficult to deal with. But I think what we're trying to see is Rosemary Ruther is a really balanced kind of person, often taking rather moderate viewpoints. And in this case, I think she wants people to stay in the church. She understands women's anger. She tells us that's bound to happen, and we should expect that and don't repress it. But then let's gather together and work in mutuality, see if we can't make this church more representative of that new humanity that you spoke about.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Karen Cataphias, who is a local staff writer. The topic of this week's Reflections was Rosemary Radford Ruther and the Woman Church Movement. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Minister, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.